Hello, folks, and welcome back to SQL in the City Streamed. I'm Kendra Little, and I'm going to talk about the 4 keys to unlocking DevOps. I joined Redgate recently as an evangelist, and one of the things that I've really been interested in learning about is what makes some teams successful at DevOps and why it is much harder in some situations. And that's what we're going to talk about in this talk. This is not a technical talk. This is not a demo talk. This is a talk about what helps make people be able to deliver value to their customers more quickly and have more fun while they're doing it without having to stay at the office all weekend and sleep at the floor under their desks, which I used to think was cool way back at the beginning of my career. We're going to talk about a few different things. We're going to talk about pizza, we're going to talk about videos, we're going to talk about coffee, and then we're going to look at the examples that I've covered in talking about pizza, videos, and coffee and figure out why were some of the companies that I've talked about successful. What are the practices and patterns they used, and how do those relate to DevOps? And then for the not so successful example, what is different about that one? So we're going to start out by talking about pizza. And when we think about a certain pizza company called Domino's, if we think about what kind of company Domino's is, there's a couple answers that might come to mind right away. We might think, well, they're a pizza company or they're a quick service food company. And that's true, but Domino's started describing themselves a little differently back in 2015. This might, it almost certainly was in part marketing, but there is, I think, truth in this as well, which is what we're going to see. Domino's began describing themselves as an e-commerce company that sells pizza, a technology company at heart. I think there's truth in this because when we look at what has happened to Domino's over a period of time, there has been a lot of change, and it's really related to how they use technology. You may have seen some charts go around in the news in around 2017 like this. This chart shows the stock price growth of Domino's as compared to some famous big tech companies. And when you look at the stock price growth from Domino's from 2010 to 2017, their growth outperforms these big companies. And it's not just if we're comparing them to an Amazon or an Apple or a Facebook or a Google. If we compare them also to the whole S&P 500, they had phenomenal growth. This has to do with a couple different things. First off, back when they started out, they had a lot of room to grow because back in 2010, they weren't in the best place. If you think back to what Domino's used to be like, back in 2010, they had a problem. Let me go back to this slide. And if we think about back when they began here, they had pizza that was described by some customers as pizza where the crust tastes like cardboard. And we know this because the CEO who joined the company around that time started an advertising campaign where they brought customers on stage and said, well, what do you think about this pizza? And they said, well, you can get it to us pretty fast, but the crust tastes a lot like cardboard. And they said, we are going to focus on you, bringing the customers into those commercials and saying, okay, this is what we're hearing from people, and we are really going to fix it, was part of their focus on paying attention to what the customer says. They also started using technology in interesting ways around that time, and they've talked about this, how they enabled their teams to experiment in ways that weren't as expensive as they were in the past. Instead, if someone wanted to do a change, instead of having to build a big business case and saying, I want to embark on this big project, they found ways that using their technology, they could try out an experiment on a small section of their user base and see how it worked. And they could perform experiments like this for less than $2,000. They embraced a concept of failing fast. And they started doing wacky things. Wacky things like, initially, the pizza tracker. Being able to see and to understand how long is it going to take for your food to get to you, being able to know in real time, is your pizza in the oven? Is your pizza in the car? That was a really new concept because way back when Domino's was getting out of that, they just have gross pizza time. Way back then, we didn't have Postmates. We didn't have all these delivery services. So they said, well, maybe people want to see this. Maybe people want more insight into that. And they kept playing around with different things. Things that might seem a little crazy, but now they've taken experimentation to such a level that you can set your Domino's app so that when you open it, it automatically places the last order you made, and you have to cancel it within a certain amount of time because it turns out people want that. It turns out people want to order Domino's pizza from Slack. It turns out people want to order Domino's pizza from their Ford Fusion. They even integrate with cars. They have taken experimentation and reaching the customer so seriously that they've done things that I wouldn't have imagined possible. And even allowing things like in their phone app, letting you talk to the phone app, like not having to click buttons and place your order by voice, but without making a call. So for people who want to use voice ordering but not actually talk to a person, they even are willing to serve them. So this experimentation and being able to do it in an inexpensive way, and when things didn't work out, saying, okay, we're not going to do that, that really helped them advance their business and grow the value of their company, grow their business. There's more to it than this too. Visualization of key metrics is really important, and in Domino's, this happens in multiple ways. In the Domino's shops, like a lot of fast food companies, they use visualizations to help see where are the bottlenecks in the flow of process. This is something we do in tech teams now, inspired by lean methodology, but in Domino's, it actually happens across the company in interesting ways, even in the pizza shops. And they've even integrated this in the apps themselves too. You can send a compliment to the team making your pizza in the app, and through the magic of the internet, I was able to verify that, in fact, they do see the messages. Through Reddit, there is a Domino's subreddit where you can see people chatting about the fact that they actually see these on their visualization boards. So Domino's was able to really, really grow their business with this focus on the customer, with this relentless experimentation, and with really interesting takes on visualization, because if we think about the Domino's pizza tracker itself, what is that but providing your customer with a visualization of progress as well? Really interesting things in terms of growing that business. But not all companies have been so successful. Looking at another example of a famous company that we all know of, or most of us know of these days, Blockbuster is an example of a company that I think has almost disappeared. I believe there is one Blockbuster video left in the world, and it is in my home state of Oregon in the United States. I believe it's in Bend, Oregon. There used to be one in Alaska, but I believe it finally closed there. So there's one remaining Blockbuster video shop, which is more like a museum than a real store. But back in the day, Blockbuster used to be everywhere. You could always walk into a video store. They used to be incredibly popular. And when we think about why Blockbuster failed, a lot of times we just think about the fact that we think, well, Blockbuster, they just didn't understand what was happening, right? They didn't understand the power of the internet. They didn't know they were going to get beaten by Netflix and Amazon Prime and all of these other delivery things. But that's not quite true. And folks who have looked back at what happened at Blockbuster have said, in fact, they almost succeeded. It's much more complicated than we tend to think. Way back when Blockbuster was popular, we had large video cassettes. You would go to the store and you would leave with actually large items. And part of the revolution started happening not with digital streaming. That wasn't first. What happened first was DVDs made mailing videos much cheaper than they could have been with the larger cassettes. Netflix's early business model was a mail order business. And that competition started ramping up, but Blockbuster had a position of strength because what they found from their customers was, you know, we don't always plan ahead as people. On Friday, I may not have thought of on Wednesday that I want to watch a movie on Friday night. On Friday, I may want to go to the video store and get something. So Netflix started competing, but it wasn't severe at first. And if we look at a chart of Blockbuster's revenue, this chart shows the top line is revenue and the bottom line is operating income. this chart's from the Harvard Business Review. They did an interview with John Antioco, who was the CEO of Blockbuster for many of the years during the tail of them. And what happened was that as the Netflix competition started ramping up, Antioco came up with a plan called Total Access. And the idea was that we can leverage the existing stores to beat Netflix because of this indecision issue. Because why wouldn't I rather have both? Because maybe on Wednesday, I do order my video for Friday, although delivery was less optimized then. So really I had to kind of order it on Monday or Tuesday if I want it on Friday. But maybe I get it and I start watching it and I'm just not that crazy about it. Well, what if I could take it into the store? And what if I could say, hey, I want something else on Friday if it didn't work out? Well, that's a happier story to me than not having a store and just kind of having to watch a movie that I'm actually not that excited about after watching the first 5 minutes. The Total Access plan did, after it was launched, you can see that when it comes to the operating income, it was pretty expensive because we've got to build online services, which we didn't have a ton of specialists in back then. We've also got to handle something that was a really big deal back then, which was late fees. Blockbuster's original model involved penalties if you were late returning your movie, and Netflix didn't do this. So part of the Total Access plan and part of making this really compelling to people was not only letting them get their videos mailed to them, but also canceling the late fees. And that's why we see those dips in operating income. But you can see that the revenue wasn't doing too bad, and they were actually bringing on new subscribers at one point faster than Netflix was. They were going to win. But as we can see, looking at this graph, they didn't win. As we know, there's just one Blockbuster left in the world. There was a major plummet there. And Antioco, the CEO who conceived this Total Access plan, left the company and things went bad. And as the story goes, he did buy some Netflix stock, I believe, after he left the company. Well, why did it fail? There's a great article by Greg Sittel that I've got a link to here. And if you download the slides from this talk on the SQL in the City website, I've got a references section at the end where you can dig into these articles if you're interested in learning more about the story. But Greg Sittel looked into the history of Blockbuster and just analyzed, so why did this fail when the Total Access plan had a lot of these ingredients for success and in fact was taking on new subscribers? It takes more than a CEO to change the direction of a company. Often as practitioners in a company, we can feel disempowered and we can look at others and think, well, if only we had that one supporter, things could change. The truth is that we do have a lot of power as practitioners, but even when we have as powerful a person as the CEO, we can't just say, hey, I've got this idea, we should do it, and then it's going to happen. We have to think about cultural change, and we have to think about identifying partners within our company and identifying people across different areas of the business. We need to communicate with them and share our ideas and help them see the value of what we're planning. In the Blockbuster scenario, the franchisees weren't on board with this. They were threatened by this Total Access program. And it's not necessarily just that, oh, this example has franchises. Well, Domino's has franchises too, right? We need to make sure that people see and understand the value of different changes, because human nature is just that if we don't understand what other people are doing, if parts of the business are built in a silo, we may think that we don't have a part in the future if they are helping take us to the future. And in fact, that wasn't the case and didn't have to be the case, because that ability to combine the models, to have a store model as well as an online model, could have actually flourished and had interesting results that maybe we actually don't have today because the streaming model has really taken over everything. We really need to think about how to make those changes when we're starting a change in our company. So we do need to talk to executives and get executive champions when we want to change things. But it's not only about getting executive support. A lot of cultural change happens from talking to people outside of our silo or outside of our own little team there. A third example of a company, and one of my favorites because I absolutely love coffee and I have a Nespresso machine at home. This is a global presentation, so in some parts of the world, you will be very familiar with Nespresso. And at home in the United States, people aren't that familiar. And for those of you who aren't that familiar with espresso, or with Nespresso, they are not an independent, small, nimble company. They are part of Nestle, and part of a large conglomerate. So they have to figure out how to be nimble within a much larger environment. And they began in 1986 with just 5 employees. In 1998, they started up their e-commerce platform. And now in 2018, they are not 5 employees anymore. They have 12,000 employees across 40 countries. And in their digital operations group, they have 500 people. They sell coffee both online and in the stores. You might wonder, people in the United States especially, might wonder, how do they have 12,000 employees? Well, Nespresso operates with a boutique experience. What they describe their in-store experience as is a boutique experience. You can go in there, you can, they're beautiful. You can smell the coffees, you can admire the machines, you can sort of revel in this whole, I love this delicious caffeinating beverage experience, or you can buy things online. There's a really interesting talk given by Cyril Lamblard, who is the Chief E-commerce Officer of Nespresso. He did a talk on one of the Forrester podcast episodes. It's about Nespresso and their digital transformation. What he talked about is in terms of the advancement of Nespresso and how they have succeeded, how they got to that growth of from 5 employees to thousands of employees and 500 people working on their digital platforms. They said that doing that and building an electronic platform that complements that in-store experience was a business transformation. A key part of how they do that is that they orient everyone toward the customer experience together. In that last section, when I was talking about why Blockbuster didn't have this cultural transformation, part of this ability to speed up the delivery of services to your customer is to have everyone in the company really focus on making the customer experience as good as possible and changing it in ways that we might not have thought of recently, but really having everyone think about that. And this isn't just a concept. When we say, okay, we all need to think about the customer, this can really kind of, okay, yeah, but what do we really do? Sometimes we really do what we're rewarded on. And I mean rewarded in a basic my paycheck kind of way, because in this podcast, he said, I am the head of e-commerce, but we take global outcomes really seriously. Part of getting our company to really focus on the customer means that we need to care about the customer experience, whether they're going into the boutique alone, whether they're going online alone, or whether they're using both. Because if I work in e-commerce, I am naturally going to want customers to just use the website. I'm not really going to want to think about, oh, what about the customer who goes into the store and then they don't make a purchase? Either they're not ready or they've got someplace to go or whatever, and then later on they go online. If I work in e-commerce, I'm not going to think about that unless I focus on a global outcome. If the global outcome of a customer has a good experience, whether they're in-store, online, or in a combination, if I am rewarded on that global outcome, I am going to care more about making sure that the same sale the customer saw in the store is available online, that they don't feel cheated by no longer having that option, and that the experience is seamless between those, and that the support experience can be seamless between those as well. So he said, my bonus, even though I'm in charge of e-commerce, my bonus is dependent upon the success of the physical stores, not just the success of the e-commerce platform. That is a really important thing, and that's one of the key things to breaking down these barriers between groups. For years, we've had developers rewarded on how fast they can ship features and DBAs rewarded on stability of production. Those are not global outcomes. We need to think about ways in which we can have global outcomes and measure teams. And I'm not just talking about development and DBAs either. We also have to bring in the customer support teams, to bring in the sales teams. We have to bring in the marketing teams too, because marketing is all about understanding what the customer experience is as well. And we need to think about outcomes from them together. part of changing those outcomes that we're measured on is going to take bringing on people at different levels of leadership who believe in this too. It's not always an executive who makes those changes, though. Thinking about how we measure these outcomes often happens in the middle of a company and at lower levels of it too. But Nespresso has really shown that you can take this up to the highest levels of the company, and that the way forward for a lot of companies who take this seriously involves even setting executive bonuses based on these global outcomes as well. He said lots more in that Forrester podcast episode about how they have made cultural changes at Nespresso. It's a great episode, so I've got the link in the slides to it if you want to learn more as well. Well, let's step back and think about this in a format about DevOps. Let's take the lessons from these three companies, two successful, one not as successful, and get a little bit more practical about this. We at Redgate see a structure of 4 keys to unlocking DevOps. And I really think this is a fantastic way of thinking about how DevOps can help and explaining how DevOps can work to other people. I'm going to talk about these today, not in terms of tools, but I'm going to talk about them in terms of cultural change. The first part of this way to think about DevOps is about standardization and the importance of standardization. And when it comes to tools, we think about standardizing our code and getting it into version control, getting code quality in, having configuration. But this makes sense in a cultural way as well, because when it comes to DevOps, we do need to standardize in terms of our orientation, and everyone needs to focus on the customer, from the marketing folks to the dev team to the IT team. And we need to actually talk to one another across these silos so that we actually are prioritizing what the customer experience is rather than letting things get caught up as, that we slowly work on things across teams. If we prioritize and orient with these global outcomes, if we standardize on global outcomes, it becomes much easier to work with one another because, in fact, our rewards are based upon the culture, the customer's success, rather than us competing and focusing on different aspects of our system stability or release tempo. The second part, the second key to unlocking DevOps is automation. And of course, we all think about automation a lot, specifically when it comes to tools and removing manual work. And that's absolutely valid, but there's cultural aspects to automation as well. When we think about automation in DevOps, a lot of it really is about what does the automation enable, right? What is the point of automation? Well, yes, to reduce manual work is part of it, but automation is also what can really enable us to do things like deploy experiments cheaply to a small section of our population. We aren't going to be able to check out if a new feature works on a small segment of our population for less than $2,000 if we're doing every step of that manually. Getting automation in place allows us to constantly focus on improvement and learning more about what our customers actually will use and what our customers actually want. So it takes that slowness and expensiveness out of the experimentation, which is very, very important. The third key to unlocking database DevOps is monitoring. Monitoring, we typically think of as just, is the system online? I've still got this logic in my head that's like monitoring is uptime, or maybe that monitoring is based on performance. Monitoring has become a lot more than that, and we need to think of monitoring in new ways these days, because yes, it does still have to do with, is the system up? But we need to rephrase that at this point. The question isn't really, is the server on? Yeah, that's a component, but the real question is, can the customer access what they need to access? Because we can build our systems in a resilient way so that even if this server goes off, even if there's a power outage, or like Richard was saying earlier, someone drills into the wrong place and a data center goes offline, we can design systems so that the customer experience still is okay, or at least is not completely offline. It might be degraded, but still available. Monitoring, yes, we are thinking about uptime, but we're also just thinking about, can the customer do what they need to do? And we want to have visibility of that. We want people to know about that. We want the people in marketing to know about that, because they may need to respond to all of the tweets that come in now when your service is offline, right? That didn't used to be an issue, but now people across the business, people in sales need to know about this because it may impact their deals if you're having an outage, and they need to be able to communicate well with the customer, people in customer support. But also we want to know about when is the customer's experience really good? Sometimes we release a small change and people love it. Sometimes we release a small change and people don't. We want visibility into that in a way that isn't intrusive, in a way that does respect privacy, of course. More and more, we want this visibility to not just be for the IT team. We want it to be for business people as well, because people in the business may see that from this data. Hey, it turns out that people are using these features differently than we actually thought they would when we designed them. This happens all the time. And when I first worked in customer support, this was just something I learned about the tools. You actually start talking to the customer and they'll basically say, oh yeah, we hacked your tool to do this thing that's what we actually need to do, and please don't break it. Well, we want to know about that. You want to know about that so that maybe that's something you should actually offer people and can make money off of. And we need to empower people across the business to be able to understand this and do something about it. And that monitoring is more and more about that visibility there. The final key to unlocking database DevOps is protection. So far we've had standardization, automation, monitoring, and then the fourth key to unlocking DevOps is protection. Protection, of course, is incredibly important. Protection is part of making sure that if those terrible accidents do happen and our server is offline, do we have a backup of that data that we can restore from? So there's very classic forms of protection that are still important. Designing against disaster is still important. But another part of protection that's really increasingly important as well is protecting the data. Richard and I talked a little bit earlier about making sure that we aren't just protecting in production, that other environments that we are protecting the data there as well. But I want to talk about a separate aspect here too. It's really important to make sure that we, when we're using data, use data in accord with our customers' consent as well as the customer's intent. And I say consent and intent. This really resonated with me. There was a talk by the CEO of Box. Box is a file sharing company. And he talked about what their mission is when they are protecting data, to not just think about what technically the customer consented to, but also, did they really want us to use this data? So in other words, if I get someone's phone number for 3-factor authentication, should I use that phone number to market to that person? Well, that wasn't their intent. And no, that's my example. That's not the example that he used. But not every company thinks that way. But I do think that in terms of the smart thing to do, when people find out that you were using that data you gave them against their intent, they are going to think badly of your brand. They are going to think about not using your company anymore. More and more in this digital world, we live in a world where not only is it really easy for other companies to copy products, but it's really, really easy for scandals to dissuade people from using your brand in cases where they find out that, oh my goodness, there's secretly a microphone in my bed that I didn't know about and it was in the EULA that I accepted. Yes, I saw this on the internet the other day. So maybe check the EULA for your mattress when you buy it these days. But more and more, it's important to think about not just the customer consent, but also the customer intent. These 4 keys together for unlocking DevOps, not only do they have to do with how we implement DevOps, but I think they do also contain the keys for how we have cultural changes, how we work with others in our company. So we want to standardize on the customer, and that means setting global outcomes that bring us together across teams. We want to think about automation, and we want to think about how it can enable us to experiment in a safe way, how we can fail fast when testing out new features and see what really works for our customers and what doesn't, so we don't go too far down the wrong roads and we do establish the right paths that are what our customers really want to do. We need to monitor, and we need to start thinking about monitoring as visibility that not only helps us see, hey, when is there a problem that we need to react to fix what's happening with the customer, but also to get visibility into what customers like, what customers don't like, so we can make the right decisions about how we design our products. And we need to, along the way, protect and preserve data to make sure that we are following the guidelines with protecting the data that are what the customer would want. And as more and more we could all be the victim of a hack, this becomes very personal to all of us. Next up, we are going to have the Chris's. So you may know the Chris's from our DB Ale podcast. And by the way, if you haven't listened to our DBA Ale podcast, you really should. They enjoy beer as well as DevOps regularly on that. And they're going to talk about compliant database DevOps and resources that you can use to get your journey kickstarted. So that's coming up next. Join on in. Thanks for joining me, folks. Goodbye.